Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning. And today my guest is Mark Josephsberg, who is an Alexander Technique teacher in New York City, in Manhattan. He's been a teacher for about 10 years. And we're going to talk today about what might be called traps or obstacles that someone learning the Alexander Technique might encounter as part of their learning process. And because this is something I've been wanting to put out there for a while, Mark is actually going to interview me on this topic. So Mark, welcome, and you can start asking me questions.
Okay, great. Welcome to your show, Robert.
Thanks. I always like to be a guest on my own show.
That's right. And so, before we get into the traps, what interests you about the idea of traps in the Alexander Technique?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what interests me. I think the Alexander Technique is an incredibly powerful and in some ways an incredibly simple process. Mm-hmm. Simple, but not necessarily always easy. Mm-hmm. And I believe there are some pretty classic traps or obstacles that students who are studying the technique encounter. Not all students encounter all of these. I think most teachers listening to this will recognize them all. I don't have any great new discoveries here, but I do want to kind of put them out there in a systematic way. And I think one reason for doing this also is that while the Alexander Technique is, as I say, a really simple process, maybe too simple, there are some traps or obstacles that are kind of unique to it compared to other things. So that's the background.
So the simplicity might lend itself to having some traps.
The simplicity lends itself to that, and also the fact that the Alexander Technique is such a different way of thinking about things like posture and movement than what most people coming to it are used to. That it's very easy for people to slip into forgetting that and wanting and thinking more in terms of more traditional approaches to those topics.
Right. Okay, so I think we're ready to talk about trap number one.
Trap number one. Well, I think the most classic trap of all is a tendency to try to recreate feelings. By feelings, I'm talking about physical sensations that a student gets during a lesson. Teacher helps you. You have this feeling of lightness, perhaps. Maybe you feel like your head's floating on top of your spine. And there's a natural inclination to think, well, I guess what I need to do now is try to either hold on to that feeling or at some point in the future recreate that feeling. Mm-hmm. And for reasons that I think most Alexander teachers understand pretty well, that's not an effective strategy. And basically because the feelings are a kind of a byproduct of a process, or the result of a process. A teacher helps you and you feel differently, or you self-direct yourself and you get this feeling that's very nice, and you want to keep the feeling, not realizing that the feeling is a result of something else. And when you get sucked into the feeling, you almost immediately lose track of the process that brought it about.
So it's occurring to me now that it might not be a bad thing to want to recreate the feeling, but it's how you recreate the feeling. And I'm thinking that the way you want to recreate the feeling is to recreate the principles that got you there.
Well, that's an interesting take on it. The only thing is that the thing that got you to a certain feeling today might get you to quite a different feeling tomorrow.
That's true. That's true.
And I agree with you. It certainly shows on the student's part an interest in the work, and that's good, and a sense that there's something they can do. But I think trying to latch on to feelings is kind of a dead end.
I agree. I think that maybe as you try to recreate like I think it felt like this, it sort of was like this. I think that's the trap.
Yes.
But I think it's kind of a natural thing to think, oh, I felt like whatever, I was light. It's not a bad idea to want to feel that again.
Oh, I agree. Although the lightness you feel tomorrow or next week may have a different quality to it.
Or the next moment.
Or the next minute or second.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's a trap, and it's a very insidious, I believe that's the word, insidious trap, because a lot of times these feelings are very pleasant.
That's right.
And they are tempting. They really want to draw you in. Mm-hmm. And I think new students, and not just new students, old students and teachers.
That's right.
We are all susceptible to that.
Yeah.
I've been teaching for some 30-odd years, and I can get caught up in that easily. Mm-hmm. So that's a trap that I think most teachers and probably most students of any duration are pretty familiar with. The second one I want to talk about is wanting to get a right position or wanting to be right. They're kind of related. Students will often come in, say in their second lesson, and say, okay, is my head in the right position now? Yeah, I'm sure you've had that happen, Mark.
About 4 times today.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one that has an awful lot to do with general ideas in our society about posture. Most posture advice is about putting yourself in a certain position, head held up high, or chest lifted, or shoulders pulled back, or who knows. I mean, they're all terrible, and they're all static. They're all positional.
They're a position, a pose.
Yeah, even if they were good positions, they're I mean, those examples that I just gave are all terrible things to do. But even if you had something that sounded sort of reasonable, but was put in the framework of being right in terms of a position, that wouldn't really be much use because we're constantly changing. We're breathing. We're always moving a little bit. Alexander, the F. Matthias Alexander, the developer of this work, famously said, when asked about right positions, he said, there is no right position, but there is a right direction. Mm-hmm. And the direction being a kind of the mental the mental statement that you're making to yourself about what you would like to happen.
I also find as part of that trap that there's just the right and wrong in general.
Yes.
Positionally or not.
The whole idea of something being right, something being wrong. And again, I think an awful lot of that is just part of our the larger society out there's way of viewing things. I had a client the other day who kept referring to her bad leg. And I thought to myself, if I were her leg, I'd be really irritated at that point, you know? Mm-hmm. But that's how doctors talk. That's how PTs talk. That's how people talk.
Yeah.
And doesn't get you very far with the studying the Alexander technique.
Do you have anything that you say to somebody when they ask, is this right?
Well, I basically kind of do the same spiel I'm doing with you. It's not about position. Mm-hmm. Forget about position. I tell students that if they catch themselves thinking in terms of being right or being in the right place or doing something the right way, that would be that's great that they caught themselves thinking that way, and that they could just now let go of it because it'll never be useful.
So are you saying that the Alexander technique is more than just posture?
Well, I think it's about posture among other things,
Yeah.
but I think it's about posture seen as a verb, not a noun, and it's a dynamic concept.
Right.
So
Okay, you ready for another trap?
I am, and this is a little bit related to the last one. The idea that you have to effort or try to put Alexander ideas into practice. Another word would be concentrate. People will often say, well, I've been concentrating on the directions. And I think to myself, probably not a good idea. And in fact, I would go so far to say that in terms of directing oneself, whatever Alexander directions you're using, and there are a lot of different variants these days, but whatever the kind of directing you're doing, the lighter and easier and softer you can think them, the more effective they're going to be.
That's great.
And I think that the as long as you don't lose track of it entirely, right. But super light, super soft, if you like, and I would also say super forgiving of forgetting them, because you are going to forget them in an instant. And I think when you say, okay, I'm gonna do a little directing about my neck. Let's say you're using a classic Alexander direction. I'm letting my neck be free, or I would prefer I'm not tensing my neck, but whatever you're using, and you say I want to take that into this activity that's going to last half a minute or whatever. I think you should go into that knowing that you're going to forget it probably within a second or two. And that's okay. And when you notice it, you just gently bring it back.
Right, so don't hold on. It is related to the other one. Don't hold on. Don't try to grasp or grip it. And also, I think, Alexander, didn't he write about, he wrote about concentration and that, furrowed brow, kind of laser-like. I don't know if he said laser-like, but that kind of limiting kind of thinking about something.
Yes.
And he also said something, I believe, about concentric circles. Like that's a different way to look at it. Like a bunch of circles that have a central meeting point. That's the thing that you're, let's say, highlighting. But the rest of things you could still see on the periphery. So it's a more gentle way to look at it, I think, than just zeroing in on one thing.
Yes, I think anything that can make your self-directing more gentle is whatever trick you can use to make it softer or more gentle, the more effective and powerful it's going to be. I think in our society, in general, when people are thinking about specific things, very specific things, there tends to be a tendency to kind of concentrate or narrow one's focus on them. And when people are thinking in a very light and easy way, it tends to be about sort of vague things like, oh, it's a nice day today, or I am enjoying the breeze, or whatever. And I think the combination of a gentle intent or interest and a highly specific thing like my neck, you really can't get much more specific than that. That combination of a very light intent about what you want applied to a very specific object, if you like, or part of you, or however you want to look at it, that's not something that people are used to. But it's certainly within most people's ability to learn. It just requires a little practice.
And and as you said before, it's just different.
It's different. Yeah.
Moving on.
All right. Expecting instant results. So a person can come to a lesson They leave the lesson, they feel like they're practically flying out the door, and then the next morning, hey, they're right back where they were as far as they can tell. And you've seen that, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
all the time. And people can easily get an impression that all they need is to be shown something once or twice, or maybe just a few lessons, couple of lessons. And that's really all they should need in order to make these changes, because the changes themselves seem so deceptively simple. And I wouldn't argue the fact that there probably are people out there who all they need is a couple of lessons, but they're pretty rare. They're pretty rare. And I think to think that you're going to change the harmful habits of a lifetime in a lesson or two or in a few days experimenting is for most people unrealistic. And then what you have is a kind of a disappointment setting in, and then someone will say, well, it seemed like a good thing, but I never really got very far with it. That sort of thing.
When I approached my first lesson, I was in pretty intense neck pain. I remember what I expected going in. I walked out in exactly the same intense neck pain, but with a feeling of this is it. Because this was the only thing I encountered where I could take control of my own life instead of just going, fix me, fix me, fix me, because it was pretty bad. This told me you can fix yourself. And even though my pain was exactly the same, I just felt, I guess Oprah would say, empowered.
Yeah, and you might have been lucky to have that experience. It could be that if your pain had all gone away and then came back the next morning, you would have been discouraged.
Right.
Yeah. And I think related to that expecting instant results is this whole idea of being upset by what seem like setbacks. So, I've had so many students, they'll come in the second lesson and say, oh, work was so much easier, sitting was a lot easier at the computer, I didn't have anywhere near as much shoulder pain. And then that might carry on for a couple, 2 or 3 or 4 lessons, and then they'll say, oh, you know what, I started getting those shoulder pains again. And, I'm not sure this is working. And could be that they need a little help rethinking how they're self-directing. Could be they've inadvertently picked up some ideas, some add-on ideas of their own, which are often not very helpful, and you just you have to address that. But I think it is easy for people to get discouraged if they've had progress and then it seems like not much is happening.
Right. I think as teachers, we have to be prepared for that.
Totally. We have to be prepared for that.
Because in the general direction of up, there's going to be ups and downs. I've also had people come, and I bet you have too, the second lesson, and they said, I did what you told me about having a string pulling up on my head and lifting my all this stuff that I never said.
I know. And it is amazing how people will attribute to you, the teacher, ideas that you never in a million years would say. But exactly. I think again the problem here is that because our approach to things is so out of sync with most ideas about how to improve your physical functioning, that people kind of will just tack on something they've always assumed to be true to what they're learning from you.
That's right, right.
And you just have to be aware of that and be gentle in nudging them away from that.
That's right. And I sit and I listen to it and I just say, I'm so glad you came back.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Any more traps?
I one more that I've encountered is, and this is an intriguing one really to me. Sometimes, particularly students that have pain, but it could be other students as well. They may notice that they're hurting more in some ways after a lesson or two. maybe even different places. And there are a lot of possible reasons for that, but one reason is that as they start to become more sensitive to what's going on, they'll notice tension more readily in areas that they hadn't noticed before. And also another possibility is that when you start to change your functioning, some parts of your body are being called upon to do stuff they never had to do before, and they're not going to be super happy about that, and there may be some discomfort. And it's tricky because on the one hand, if people who are in pain come to you for that reason, you have to be very careful about how you explain that, because it could sound as if you're saying, whatever happens, it's good, right? Yeah. Pain goes away, well, that's the Alexander technique. Pain gets worse, well, that's part of your progress, Right. And I think you got to be very, very careful about how you explain that to students.
I do too. I think that's a really good trap for a teacher when that happens.
Yeah, and say more about that.
Well, it's just what you said. So somebody says, well, that pain is kind of gone, but now I have the pain over here. Not to fall into any kind of trap, to say, well, that can happen. And just to...
or to try to fix that new pain.
Or to fix the new pain.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be, I tell people sometimes that they're using muscles they're not used to using. Some muscles that maybe some of the deep postural muscles need to be used. Other muscles, are overworking. They may be overdoing it. They just may, I'm freeing their neck to force their head forward and up, so they could be overdoing it. And what I think it is the third option, which is some kind of option. It's a combination of overdoing and not being used to using those muscles. But it's just hard as a teacher because, we don't want to end game, but we do have goals, And if somebody comes in with pain, we really do want them. It would be nice if they were out of pain.
It would, yeah. But it's another factor is that when muscles that have been chronically held begin to release, the little sensing mechanisms wake up, and you start to feel the tension that's still there.
You start to feel.
Yeah, you start to feel. And the example I like to give, when I was teaching in full-time in Toronto, I lived just a block or so away from a big medical, not a medical center, but a building that had lots of doctors' offices in it. And I'd walk by there in the morning, and there'd be a lot of cabs coming, dropping people off, a lot of elderly people. And they often were very stiff in their movements, and some of them, it looked like they really could almost not turn their heads at all. I mean, if they were facing away from you and wanted to talk to you, they had to turn their whole body to do that. Most of them, I think, would say, if you asked them if they had any neck pain, they'd probably say no. But they would recognize some of the effects of a stiff neck, like their balance was compromised, or they fell over, or breathing was restricted, but they wouldn't necessarily feel any pain in their neck. And if you as an Alexander teacher come along and get a little mobility there, they might start to feel some neck pain that they hadn't felt before, which actually in that case was a symptom of a little more freedom.
Interesting. Yeah. So they're holding, or they may be blocking the pain, or holding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you tighten your fist for a couple of months, you're not going to feel it. And if someone comes along, or you somehow figure out how to let go of some of that tension, it's going to be very painful at first.
Right.
So those are the traps I've thought of. Do you have any you want to add to this list?
No, I don't think so.
Wow. Well, then maybe this will be a good time to bring our interview to a close.
Would you like to say anything else about traps or anything else, Robert?
I think it's helpful for both teachers and students particularly students who are not familiar with the process, to realize that the Alexander technique's incredibly powerful, but it's not always as simple as it seems. Or it's as simple as it seems, but that can be a bit of a trap itself, I guess is how I would phrase it.
Okay.
Well, you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't. I'm just sitting here listening and enjoying it.
All right. Well, so my guest and interviewer today has been Mark Josephsberg, an Alexander teacher in New York City. If you live in New York, we'll put a link to his website by the interview. If you live anywhere else, we'll put a link to a site where you can find an Alexander teacher wherever you are. Mark, thanks so much for doing this.
Great. It was fun, Robert.